My former colleague stood at the podium of the American College of Surgeons annual conference and told 300 doctors that I had killed a patient 30 years ago. He said this while a PowerPoint presentation behind him displayed what he claimed was evidence: medical charts, newspaper clippings, a death certificate, all pointing to me as the surgeon responsible for a preventable death. Dr. Michael Stevens spoke with that rehearsed concern I'd been hearing rumors about for weeks. He told the audience that Dr. Richard Bennett was one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in Philadelphia, but that in 1994, I had made a decision that cost a 28-year-old man his life, a decision driven by arrogance, by refusing to follow established protocols, by believing I knew better than everyone else. I sat at a table near the back, watching this man I'd known for 45 years systematically destroy my reputation in front of colleagues who'd respected me my entire career. Some of them were looking at me with shock. Some were looking away in embarrassment. None of them knew what to believe. Michael explained to the audience that James Morrison had died on my operating table because I had attempted an experimental procedure without proper authorization, without consulting other surgeons, without following safety protocols. And then, for 30 years, I had covered it up. My hands were shaking, not from age, not from nervousness, from rage so pure I could barely see straight. Tomorrow is my 70th birthday. My daughter Sarah planned a celebration at the hospital where I worked for 40 years. She invited everyone: former colleagues, former patients, former students I trained, 200 people who knew me, who worked with me, who trusted me. What she doesn't know is that I've invited someone else. Someone Michael Stevens doesn't know exists. Someone who's going to walk into that party and prove that everything Stevens just said is a lie. But to understand how we got here, to understand how a man I once called a friend could stand in front of 300 doctors and accuse me of malpractice and murder, I need to take you back. Back to when we were both young surgeons who thought we could save the world. My name is Dr. Richard Bennett. I'm 68 years old, and this is the story of how jealousy can turn a colleague into an enemy, and how the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how long it takes. I was born in 1956 in Baltimore, Maryland. My father was a general practitioner who ran a small clinic in a working-class neighborhood. My mother was a nurse. Medicine wasn't just our family business. It was our family identity. My earliest memories are of my father's clinic, the waiting room always full of people who couldn't afford to go anywhere else, the smell of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol, the sound of my father's calm voice as he examined patients, explaining their conditions in words they could understand. He'd call me over, sometimes when I was just a boy, tell me to listen to a patient's lungs through his stethoscope, point out the crackling sound of pneumonia, explain what treatment was needed. He taught me to see patients as people, not cases. Taught me that medicine was about more than diagnosis and treatment. It was about trust, about being there when people were most vulnerable. I knew I wanted to be a doctor from the time I was 8 years old. Not for the money or the prestige, because I'd seen what my father did, seen how he helped people who had nowhere else to turn, seen how he made a difference every single day. I went to Johns Hopkins for undergrad, got accepted to their medical school in 1978. That's where I met Michael Stevens. He was in my class. Brilliant mind, photographic memory, could recite entire textbooks word for word. Everyone knew he was going to be someone important in the field. We became friends those first few years, studied together late into the night, competed for top grades in a way that pushed us both to be better. Both of us were driven, both of us obsessed with being the best. But there was a difference between us that I didn't fully understand at the time. I wanted to be the best so I could help more people. Michael wanted to be the best so people would know he was the best. That distinction would define our entire careers. We both specialized in cardiac surgery. Both did our residencies at Johns Hopkins Hospital under Dr. Robert Morrison, one of the finest cardiac surgeons in the country. Both of us pushing ourselves to exhaustion, learning everything we could about the human heart and how to repair it. But Michael was better than me. At least, that's what everyone said. He had faster hands, better spatial reasoning, higher success rates on complex procedures. By the time we finished our residencies in 1986, Michael Stevens was being recruited by every major hospital in the country. Teaching hospitals, research hospitals, places where careers were made. He chose Massachusetts General in Boston. Prestigious position, high salary, perfect launching pad for an academic career, everything he'd worked for. I chose Philadelphia General Hospital, not as prestigious, not as high-paying, but it served a community that desperately needed good cardiac surgeons. Patients who couldn't afford to go to the fancy hospitals in the suburbs. Patients my father would have treated. Patients who deserved the same quality of care as anyone else, regardless of their ability to pay. Michael told me I was making a mistake, that Philadelphia General was where mediocre surgeons went to coast until retirement, that I was throwing away my potential, that I'd regret not choosing a hospital that could advance my career. I told him I was choosing the hospital that needed me most. He didn't understand. For Michael, medicine was about achievement and recognition. For me, it was about service. We stayed in touch for the first few years after residency. Christmas, cards with brief updates, occasional phone calls catching up on each other's lives. But we were living in different worlds. Michael was publishing groundbreaking papers, speaking at international conferences, building a reputation as one of the rising stars in cardiac surgery. I was doing 12 surgeries a week at Philadelphia General, teaching residents who wanted to learn how to help underserved communities, treating patients that other hospitals had turned away because they had no insurance or couldn't afford expensive procedures. I met my wife Jennifer in 1988. She was a surgical nurse at Philadelphia General. Smart and compassionate and beautiful. She understood immediately why I chose to work at a hospital that served the community instead of chasing prestige and money. She'd grown up without much money herself, understood what it meant to need medical care and not be able to afford it. We got married in 1990 in a small ceremony at her parents' church. Had the reception in the hospital cafeteria because that's where our friends were, our colleagues, our community, the people who mattered to us. Michael sent a card saying he couldn't make it. Too busy with a research project. I understood. We'd drifted apart by then, living completely different lives, pursuing completely different versions of what it meant to be a successful surgeon. Jennifer and I had our daughter Sarah in 1992, perfect little girl who looked just like her mother. I was 36 years old, established in my career, happy in my life, grateful for what I had built. That same year, Michael published a groundbreaking paper on a new technique for coronary artery bypass surgery. It reduced surgery time by 30% and improved patient outcomes significantly. The technique made him famous in the cardiac surgery world practically overnight. Everyone started calling it the Stevens technique. Medical schools began teaching it in their programs. Surgeons across the country were adopting it. Michael was being interviewed on medical shows, being invited to speak at conferences in London and Tokyo and Sydney. I was genuinely happy for him. He'd achieved exactly what he always wanted. Recognition, respect, proof that he was one of the best cardiac surgeons in the world. Then, in January 1994, everything in my life changed because of one patient and one impossible decision. A young man came into Philadelphia General Hospital at 2 a.m. James Morrison, 28 years old. Motorcycle accident on the interstate. massive trauma to his chest, multiple broken ribs, and his heart had been severely damaged in the impact. The ER called me because I was on call that night. I got to the hospital in 15 minutes, still half asleep but adrenaline kicking in the moment I saw his condition. I examined him quickly. The damage was catastrophic. His left ventricle was torn, a gaping hole in the muscle wall. He was bleeding internally. Without immediate surgery, he had maybe an hour to live. I called for an OR team, got him prepped for emergency surgery as fast as we could move. But when I opened his chest and saw the full extent of the damage, my heart sank. The tear was extensive. The surrounding tissue was badly damaged from the impact. Any sutures I placed would just rip through the weakened muscle like thread through wet paper. I stood there looking at this young man's exposed heart, beating weakly, knowing that the standard repair procedure wouldn't work. The tissue was too damaged, too fragile. Any attempt to suture it directly would fail. I had two choices in that moment. I could try the standard procedure and watch him die on my table within minutes, or I could try something different, something experimental, something I'd been developing in my personal research but hadn't been officially approved for human use yet. A technique using a synthetic mesh to reinforce damaged heart tissue, similar conceptually to what Michael had developed for coronary bypass work, but adapted for acute trauma repair. I'd done it successfully in animal trials over the past year. Pigs, mostly. But never in a human patient. Never in an emergency situation with no time to consult anyone or get proper authorization. James Morrison was going to die either way. The standard procedure wouldn't save him. I knew that with absolute certainty. But maybe, just maybe, my experimental mesh reinforcement technique would give him a chance. I made the decision. I used the mesh. I carefully placed it to reinforce the damaged tissue. I repaired the tear using the mesh as structural support. I closed him up, and I prayed harder than I'd prayed in years that it would work. He survived the surgery. His heart started beating stronger almost immediately once the repair was complete. He stabilized. He was moved to the cardiac ICU in critical but stable condition. Against all odds, against everything I'd been taught about the limitations of emergency cardiac repair, he was alive. But there was a significant problem. I hadn't followed protocol. I hadn't gotten approval from the hospital ethics board before using an experimental technique. I hadn't consulted with other surgeons. I hadn't done any of the things you're supposed to do before trying something new on a human patient. I'd made a split-second decision in the middle of an emergency surgery to use an unapproved technique on a dying man. The hospital administration found out within 24 hours. They reviewed my surgical notes. They were extremely unhappy with what I'd done. Using an unapproved experimental technique without proper authorization was a serious violation of hospital policy and medical ethics guidelines. They could have fired me on the spot, could have reported me to the state medical board, could have ended my career. But James Morrison was alive. A 28-year-old man who absolutely would have died was now breathing on his own. His heart was functioning. That had to count for something. The hospital convened an ethics board review. 5 senior doctors examining my decision, questioning my judgment, reviewing every detail of the surgery. I had to explain myself, had to justify why I'd broken protocol, had to convince them that I'd made the only choice that gave James Morrison any chance of survival. The board debated for hours. I wasn't in the room, but I heard about it later. Some members wanted me fired immediately, said I'd recklessly endangered a patient. Others argued that I'd saved a life using innovative thinking under extreme pressure. In the end, they gave me a formal written reprimand, told me in very clear terms never to use an experimental technique without proper authorization again. made me attend mandatory ethics training courses, put a note in my permanent file about the violation. But they didn't fire me, didn't report me to the medical board, essentially gave me a slap on the wrist because the outcome had been successful. James Morrison recovered remarkably well over the next 3 weeks. The mesh integrated perfectly with his heart tissue. His heart function returned to near normal levels. He was young and otherwise healthy, which helped his recovery. By week 3, he was walking around the cardiac ward, talking about getting back to his life, grateful to be alive. I gave him very specific instructions when he was discharged. He needed to come back for follow-up appointments every month for the first year. We needed to monitor how the mesh was holding up, how his heart was adapting to the repair. He couldn't do any strenuous physical activity for at least 6 months. Had to let his heart fully heal before putting any stress on it. He nodded and said he understood. Shook my hand. Thanked me for saving his life. Walked out of the hospital with his wife and his 2-year-old son. And then he disappeared. Never came back for a single follow-up appointment. Not one. I tried calling the phone number he'd given us, left multiple messages, sent letters to his address. Nothing. No response. He'd vanished. I worried about him constantly those first few months. Worried that something had gone wrong with the repair, that he'd collapsed somewhere, that my experimental technique had failed after all. But I had no way to find him, no way to know if he was okay. Then about a year after his surgery, I got a phone call that made my blood run cold. A medical examiner from Cleveland, Ohio. They'd found James Morrison dead in a motel room. Drug overdose. Heroin. He'd been dead for 2 days before anyone found him. The medical examiner was calling me because they'd found the synthetic mesh in his heart during the autopsy. They wanted to know if it had contributed to his death, if there had been any complications from the experimental surgery. I explained the emergency surgery, explained the mesh technique, explained that he was supposed to have been coming in for follow-up appointments, asked them what the autopsy showed about his heart function. The examiner told me that his heart had been functioning perfectly at the time of death. The mesh had integrated beautifully. No signs of rejection or complications. No scarring beyond what you'd expect from the original trauma. His heart was completely healthy. Cause of death was ruled as acute heroin toxicity. Massive overdose. The heart repair was noted in the autopsy report as a previous medical intervention, but completely unrelated to his death. I hung up the phone and sat in my office for an hour, trying to process what I'd been told. I'd saved this young man's life, given him a second chance. Spent sleepless nights worrying about whether my experimental technique would hold, and he'd thrown it all away on drugs. Died alone in a motel room a year later. It haunted me, made me wonder if I should have just let him die on the table, if saving him had even mattered, if all that risk and stress and ethics violations had been worth it for someone who was just going to kill himself with drugs a year later anyway. But I pushed those thoughts away. Told myself that my job was to save lives, not to judge whether those lives were worth saving. Told myself that James Morrison had made his own choices, that what happened to him after he left my hospital wasn't my responsibility. I moved on, continued my work at Philadelphia General, saved other lives, trained other residents, built my career one surgery at a time over the next 26 years. Michael's career continued to soar during those same years. By the late 90s, he was chief of cardiac surgery at Massachusetts General, publishing papers constantly in all the major journals, winning prestigious awards, being recognized as one of the top cardiac surgeons in the entire country, maybe the world. We'd completely lost touch by then, living in totally different worlds, following totally different paths. I'd see his name occasionally in medical journals or conference programs, feel a little pride that someone I'd gone to medical school with had achieved so much. But we weren't friends anymore, weren't even acquaintances, just two people who'd started in the same place and ended up in completely different destinations. I retired in 2020 at age 64 after 40 years at Philadelphia General Hospital. Thousands of surgeries performed, hundreds of residents trained, countless lives saved. I was proud of what I'd built, proud of the work I'd done, proud that I'd stayed true to my values even when it would have been easier to chase money and prestige. Jennifer and I moved to a small house in the suburbs, spent our time with Sarah and our 3 grandchildren, traveled a little bit, enjoyed retirement, enjoyed not having to wake up at 2 a.m. for emergency surgeries, enjoyed having time to just be. Then, 6 months ago, completely out of the blue, Michael Stevens called me. First time I'd heard his voice in over 20 years. He said he was writing his memoirs, reflecting on his long career, and he wanted to reach out to old colleagues from his early years, get their perspectives on the journey, hear their stories. He said I'd been such an important part of his time at Hopkins that he really wanted to include my perspective in his book. I was actually touched by the gesture, thought maybe after all these years, after all his success, Michael wanted to reconnect with his roots, wanted to remember where he came from and who he'd been before all the fame and recognition. I agreed to meet him for coffee. We met at a coffee shop in Center City, Philadelphia on a Tuesday afternoon. Michael looked older, much grayer than I remembered, but he still had that intense energy about him, that drive that had always defined him. We talked for over an hour about the old days, about medical school and how hard we'd worked, about our residency under Dr. Morrison and all the impossible cases we'd handled, about the different paths we'd chosen afterward and how those choices had shaped our careers. He seemed genuinely interested in my 40 years at Philadelphia General, asked detailed questions about my experiences there, about the types of cases I'd seen, about the challenges of working in an underserved community, about whether I had any regrets about not pursuing a more prestigious career path. Then he asked me something specific, whether there were any cases that still haunted me, any decisions I'd made that I still thought about years later, any moments where I'd wondered if I'd done the right thing. I thought about it for a moment. Then I told him about James Morrison, about the emergency surgery in 1994, about the impossible decision to use an experimental technique, about saving his life only to have him die from a drug overdose a year later, about how I still wondered sometimes if I should have just let him go, if saving him had even mattered in the end. Michael listened very carefully, took notes on a small notepad, asked follow-up questions about the technical details of the procedure, about what the ethics board had said, about whether there had been any official consequences for using an unapproved technique. I answered all his questions honestly, told him about the formal reprimand, about the ethics training I'd had to complete, about the note in my file, about how the hospital had basically given me a warning but let me continue practicing because the outcome had been successful. Michael nodded and said this was exactly the kind of complex ethical situation he wanted to include in his memoir, the kind of real-world dilemma that surgeons face, the gray areas that medical school doesn't really prepare you for. He thanked me for being so open and honest about it. I felt good about the conversation. Thought I was helping an old friend write a thoughtful memoir about the complexity of medical ethics. Thought I was contributing to something meaningful. I had no idea what he was really planning. Over the next few months, I started hearing strange things. Former colleagues asking me questions about the James Morrison case. Questions that seemed oddly specific. Questions about whether I'd really had authorization for the procedure, whether there had been complications I hadn't disclosed, whether the hospital had actually approved what I'd done. I didn't understand where these questions were coming from, but they kept coming. More and more people asking. The questions becoming more pointed, more accusatory. Then I got an email invitation to speak at the American College of Surgeons annual conference. It's a huge event, thousands of surgeons attending, one of the most prestigious conferences in the field. They wanted me to give a talk reflecting on my career, on working in underserved communities, on the rewards of choosing service over prestige. I was honored, saw it as a nice capstone to my career, a chance to share what I'd learned with younger surgeons, to maybe inspire some of them to consider working in communities that desperately needed good doctors. I accepted the invitation and started preparing my remarks. Then, about 2 weeks before the conference, I got another email from the organizers. They were adding a session to the program, a presentation by Dr. Michael Stevens on medical ethics and the consequences of unauthorized experimental procedures. They thought it would complement my talk nicely, provide a good balance of perspectives. My stomach dropped when I read that. I immediately tried calling Michael, left several voicemails asking what he was planning to present, asking if he was going to talk about the Morrison case, asking if we could discuss it before the conference. He never called me back, never responded to any of my messages, just completely ghosted me. I called the conference organizers, asked them what Michael's presentation was specifically about. They said it was a case study from 1994, a surgeon who used an unauthorized experimental technique on a dying patient, a patient who died a year later, an ethical violation that had been covered up for decades. He was going to present my case, the James Morrison case, but he was going to present it as malpractice, as a cautionary tale about surgeons who think they're above the rules, who play God with patients' lives. I tried calling Michael again and again over the next 2 weeks, sent emails, left messages saying we needed to talk, that he was misrepresenting what had happened, that James Morrison didn't die from surgical complications, that the autopsy had shown his heart was fine. Nothing. Complete silence. He was deliberately avoiding me because he knew exactly what he was doing. He was weaponizing a story I'd told him in confidence, twisting it to make me look like a reckless surgeon who'd gotten away with malpractice for 30 years. I told my daughter Sarah what was happening. She was furious, told me to get a lawyer, told me to fight back. But I didn't have time. The conference was in a week. I had no legal grounds to stop him from speaking, and Michael knew that. The conference was yesterday. I sat in the back of that ballroom and watched Michael Stevens spend 45 minutes systematically destroying my reputation. Watched him present the James Morrison case in the most damaging way possible, suggesting without quite directly saying it that I'd killed a patient through arrogance and recklessness. He showed the PowerPoint slides, medical charts he must have requested from Philadelphia General, probably claiming he was doing research for his memoir, the death certificate from Ohio, newspaper clippings about James Morrison's death, all presented to make it look like my experimental surgery had somehow led to his overdose a year later. He was careful with his words. Never quite accused me of murder. Never quite said the surgery killed Morrison. Just implied it. Suggested it. Presented the timeline in a way that made it seem like there was a connection. Let the audience draw their own damning conclusions. I could see it happening in real time. 300 surgeons looking at me with shock and disappointment. Colleagues who'd respected me now wondering if they'd been wrong about me all these years. Wondering if I'd been hiding malpractice. Wondering if I was the kind of surgeon who played fast and loose with patients' lives. After the presentation, I walked up to Michael. He saw me coming and actually smiled, like he'd just done something he was proud of. I asked him why he was doing this. He pretended not to understand what I meant. Said he'd just presented a case study about medical ethics. Said he hadn't even used my name in the presentation. I told him he didn't have to use my name. Everyone in that room knew he was talking about me. Everyone knew it was my case. He said that maybe I shouldn't have told him about it then. Maybe I should have kept my ethical violations to myself. His voice was cold, triumphant. This was exactly what he'd wanted. That's when I finally understood what was really happening. This wasn't about medical ethics. This wasn't about education. This was about jealousy, about Michael Stevens spending 45 years being the best, being the most successful, being the most recognized, and still somehow feeling like it wasn't enough. It was about him needing to prove that his path had been the right one, and mine had been wrong. That choosing prestige over service had been the superior choice. That I'd wasted my potential and he'd fulfilled his. And the only way he could prove that was by destroying me. I told him I'd saved James Morrison's life. That Morrison had died a year later from a drug overdose, not from my surgery. That it was documented in the autopsy report. Michael said that didn't matter. That I'd still violated protocol. That I'd still used an experimental technique without authorization. That I could have killed Morrison. That the fact I didn't was just luck, not skill. I told him it wasn't luck. It was making a decision under impossible pressure. It was choosing to try to save a life when the alternative was certain death. He called it arrogance. Said that tomorrow at my birthday party, everyone would know what I'd really done. That my reputation would be destroyed the way it should have been destroyed 30 years ago. Then he walked away, left me standing there in that ballroom, shaking with rage and disbelief. I went home and told Jennifer everything. She held my hand and said what she always says when things are hard, that the truth will come out, that it always does. I told her there wasn't enough time, that my birthday party was tomorrow, that 200 people would be there, all of them having heard Michael's presentation, all of them wondering if I was really the man they thought I was. Jennifer looked at me with those wise, knowing eyes and asked if I was sure about that, if I was sure there wasn't enough time for the truth to come out. That's when I remembered something I'd pushed to the back of my mind for 30 years, something that might change everything. I went to my study and started pulling out old boxes from my time at Philadelphia General, files I'd kept from my decades there, files I probably should have thrown away when I retired, but couldn't bring myself to discard. Too much of my life was in those boxes. I found the James Morrison file, his complete medical chart, my detailed surgical notes, the ethics board review documents, the formal reprimand letter, and buried in there, I found something else, something I'd completely forgotten about. A letter dated September 1994, 6 months after Morrison's surgery, a letter that had been sent to the hospital but never forwarded to me because I'd moved to a different office in the building. The letter was from James Morrison himself, thanking me for saving his life, explaining that he'd moved to Ohio to start fresh, to get away from the people and places and temptations that had fed his addiction, apologizing for not coming back for follow-up appointments, promising to come back once he got himself completely clean and stable. The letter was dated 4 months before he died. 4 months when he was still alive, still trying, still hoping to beat his addiction and become the person he wanted to be. But that wasn't the most important thing I found. I also found a newspaper clipping I'd saved, James Morrison's obituary from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I read it carefully this time. Read the details I'd only skimmed 30 years ago when I was too devastated by his death to really process the information. Read the part about his surviving family members. James Morrison had been survived by his wife Angela and his 2-year-old son Jacob. His son, who would be 30 years old now, who might have information about his father, who might have medical records or documentation that could prove Michael Stevens was lying about how James Morrison died. I spent the entire night searching online, looking for any trace of Jacob Morrison. It took hours of dead ends and false leads, searching social media, searching public records, searching professional databases. Finally, at 4 in the morning, exhausted and desperate, I found him. Jacob Morrison, 30 years old, living right here in Philadelphia, working as a paramedic, his father's son, living in the same city where his father's life had been saved 3 decades ago. A paramedic, which meant he understood medicine, understood emergency situations, understood the impossible decisions healthcare providers have to make. I sent him an email immediately, even though it was 4 in the morning, explained who I was, that I was the surgeon who'd operated on his father in 1994, that I needed to talk to him about something important, gave him my phone number. I didn't really expect a response. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to find someone, anyone, who could help me fight back against Michael's lies. My phone rang at 7 a.m. Jacob Morrison. He said he'd been looking for me for 5 years, ever since he'd found his father's medical records in his mother's belongings after she died of cancer. He needed to meet with me immediately. He said there was something I needed to know, something important, something that would change everything. We agreed to meet at a diner near the hospital that morning. I got there early, nervous and uncertain about what he might tell me, hoping he had information that could help, terrified he might actually confirm Michael's accusations. Jacob walked in exactly on time. He looked so much like his father. Same eyes, same build, same way of carrying himself. But he was healthy, clean, alive in a way his father never got to fully be. He sat down across from me and immediately started talking. Said he'd been searching for me for 5 years, that he'd found his father's medical records and had been trying to track down the surgeon who'd saved his life. That he had things I needed to see, things that would prove what had really happened to his father. He pulled out a thick folder and started spreading documents across the table between us. First, he showed me letters, handwritten letters from James Morrison to Angela, his wife. Letters written from Ohio during those 10 months after his surgery. Letters talking about his recovery, about his gratitude for being alive, about his plans to get clean and be a good father, about how he'd been given a second chance and wasn't going to waste it. The letters were heartbreaking to read. This young man who'd survived against all odds, trying so hard to overcome his addiction, writing about his dreams for the future, about wanting to watch his son grow up, about wanting to be someone his family could be proud of. Jacob explained that his father had enrolled in a rehab program in Ohio, had gotten a job, had been trying to rebuild his life piece by piece, but the addictions had been too strong. After 10 months of fighting, he'd relapsed, and when he relapsed, he'd overdosed. The disease had won, but those 10 months mattered. Those 10 months were real. Those 10 months existed because I'd made the decision to try to save him instead of letting him die. Then Jacob showed me something even more important, the complete autopsy report from his father's death. Not just the summary I'd been given over the phone 30 years ago, but the full detailed report. It clearly stated that James Morrison's heart had been functioning perfectly at the time of his death. The synthetic mesh had integrated completely with no signs of rejection or complications. His heart muscle had healed. His cardiac function was normal. The repair had been entirely successful. Cause of death was unambiguously listed as acute heroin toxicity, massive overdose. There was absolutely no connection between the heart surgery and his death a year later. None. The autopsy proved it beyond any doubt. Jacob explained why he'd been searching for me. He'd attended the American College of Surgeons conference yesterday as part of his continuing education as a paramedic. He'd been sitting in the back of the room during Michael's presentation. He'd heard every word. He knew immediately that Michael was talking about his father. He knew immediately that Michael was lying, that he was suggesting the surgery had somehow caused or contributed to his father's death. And Jacob knew that was completely false. He told me he needed me to know that my surgery had saved his father's life, that it had given his father 10 months he wouldn't have had otherwise, 10 months where he tried to get better, 10 months where he wrote letters home, 10 months where he hoped and dreamed and fought. His father's addiction had killed him. Not my surgery. The autopsy proved it. The medical records proved it. The timeline proved it. Then Jacob asked if he could come to my birthday party. He said he wanted to tell the truth about what had happened to his father. He wanted to defend me the way I'd defended his father's life 30 years ago. I told him the party was that afternoon, that Michael Stevens would be there, that he was planning to publicly shame me in front of 200 people, that having Jacob there to tell the real story might be the only thing that could save my reputation. Jacob said he would be honored, that I'd saved his father's life and given his mother 10 months of hope, that the least he could do was tell the truth about what had really happened. We shook hands, this 30-year-old paramedic and me, connected by a surgery that happened before he had any real memories of his father, connected by a decision I'd made in an operating room at 2 in the morning 3 decades ago. The birthday party started at 3 p.m. that afternoon. Sarah had done an incredible job planning it. The hospital conference room was decorated with photos from my 40-year career. There was food and drinks. There was a slideshow of memorable moments, and there were 200 people filling the space. Former colleagues, former patients whose lives I'd saved or improved, former residents I'd trained who'd gone on to have successful careers of their own, my family, my friends, my community. And standing near the front with that same triumphant smile on his face was Michael Stevens. He'd come. Of course he'd come. He wanted to watch me squirm, wanted to see me humiliated in front of everyone I cared about. Sarah gave a beautiful opening speech. She talked about her father, the surgeon, about the man who'd chosen to work at a community hospital instead of chasing prestige and fame, about the man who'd taught her that helping people mattered more than impressing people, about how proud she was to be my daughter. People applauded, but I could see some of them looking at me differently than they would have a week ago. They'd heard about Michael's presentation. They'd heard the rumors. They were wondering if I was really the man Sarah thought I was. Then Michael stood up without being invited, said he'd like to say a few words about me. Sarah looked surprised but nodded politely. Michael walked to the front of the room with that same confident smile. He started talking about how he'd known me for 45 years, how we'd gone to medical school together, how we'd trained together, how we'd started our careers with such similar potential. But then he started changing his tone. He said I'd always been someone who followed my own path, someone who didn't always follow the rules, someone who believed I knew better than everyone else, someone who took unnecessary risks. The room got very quiet. People could sense where this was going. Michael said he'd given a presentation at the surgeons' conference the day before, about medical ethics, about what happens when surgeons take it upon themselves to use experimental procedures without authorization, without proper oversight, without regard for the consequences. He said he hadn't named names in that presentation, but he thought everyone in this room probably knew he was talking about me, about a case from 1994, about a patient named James Morrison who I'd operated on using an unapproved experimental technique, about a young man who died a year later, about an ethical violation that had been covered up for 30 years. Sarah's face went pale. She tried to interrupt, saying this wasn't the appropriate time or place, but Michael kept talking over her. He said this was exactly the time, that everyone here needed to know who Richard Bennett really was, a surgeon who thought he was above the rules, a surgeon who experimented on dying patients without proper authorization, a surgeon who got lucky once and had been hiding that violation for decades. The room was completely silent. 200 people staring at me, some with shock, some with confusion, some with what looked like disappointment. My reputation was being destroyed right in front of me at my own birthday party. That's when the conference room door opened. Jacob Morrison walked in wearing his paramedic uniform. He walked straight to the front of the room with purpose and determination. Michael looked annoyed at the interruption. He asked who this person was and said this was a private party. Jacob said his name was Jacob Morrison, that James Morrison was his father, that he needed to say something. The room went completely silent. Everyone staring at this young man who'd just walked in and identified himself as the son of the patient Michael had been talking about. Jacob said that Michael had just told everyone that his father died because of my surgery. He said that wasn't true, that his father had died from a heroin overdose in December 1994, 10 months after I'd saved his life. Michael tried to interrupt, started saying that the point was about unauthorized procedures, but Jacob kept talking. His voice was strong and clear. He explained that his father had come into Philadelphia General Hospital at 2 a.m. with a torn heart from a motorcycle accident, that he'd been dying, that I'd made a split-second decision to try a technique that might save him, that it had worked, that his father had walked out of the hospital 3 weeks later alive. Jacob pulled papers from the bag he was carrying, said he had the complete autopsy report from his father's death, that it clearly stated his father's heart had been functioning normally at the time of his death, that the synthetic mesh I'd used had integrated perfectly, that his heart had healed completely, that the cause of death was acute heroin toxicity, not surgical complications, not heart failure, drugs. He handed the papers to someone in the front row and told them to pass it around, to let everyone see the truth. Michael's face was getting red. He said the issue wasn't how Morrison died. The issue was that I'd violated protocol, that I'd put a patient at risk, that I could have killed him. Jacob said firmly that I didn't kill him, that I saved him, that his father was 28 years old with a wife and a 2-year-old son, that I'd given him 10 more months of life, 10 months where he got to hold Jacob, 10 months where he tried to get clean, 10 months where he dreamed about being a father, 10 months he wouldn't have had if I'd followed protocol and let him die. The room was silent now. People were passing around the autopsy report, reading it carefully, seeing the documented truth. Jacob turned to face everyone in the room. He explained that he'd been a paramedic for 8 years, that he'd seen many situations where someone had to make a split-second decision about whether to try something unconventional or watch someone die, that the best medical professionals were the ones willing to take calculated risks to save lives. He looked directly at Michael, told him that yesterday's presentation had been about following rules and playing it safe and never coloring outside the lines. Said that was fine if that was Michael's philosophy, but that my philosophy was different, that my philosophy was that sometimes saving a life was more important than following a rule, that he was alive today because 30 years ago, a surgeon had that philosophy. Someone in the crowd asked what he meant about being alive. Jacob explained that his father was dead. Yes, but that he'd gotten to grow up knowing his father had tried, knowing that someone had believed his father was worth saving, that his mother had remarried when Jacob was 5, that he'd had a good childhood, that he'd become a paramedic because he wanted to help people the way I'd helped his father. He said none of that would have happened if I'd just followed protocol and let his father die on the operating table. Michael was shaking his head, trying to maintain that the issue was still about protocol violations, but his voice had lost its confidence. I stood up, told Michael I knew what this was really about, that it wasn't about ethics or protocol or proper medical procedures. Everyone turned to look at me. I said that for 45 years, Michael had been the best, the most published, the most awarded, the most famous cardiac surgeon in the country, that he'd built an entire career on being Michael Stevens, the brilliant surgeon, and that it had eaten him alive that I'd chosen a different path, that I'd chosen to work at a community hospital instead of chasing prestige, that I'd been happy being Richard Bennett, the surgeon who helped people, instead of trying to be Richard Bennett, the famous surgeon. I said he'd called me 6 months ago asking to meet for coffee, that I'd thought he wanted to reconnect after all these years, to remember the old days. But what he'd really wanted was ammunition. He'd wanted me to tell him about my failures, about my regrets, about cases that didn't go perfectly, and I'd given him James Morrison. I'd told him about the one case that still haunted me, and he'd weaponized it. I walked toward the front of the room as I spoke, told everyone that Michael had spent 6 months building a case against me, researching the Morrison case, finding the death certificate, creating a narrative that made it look like I'd killed a patient, then presenting it at a conference where he knew I'd be in the audience, where he knew he could humiliate me in front of my colleagues. Michael tried to protest, said he'd only presented a case study, that he hadn't even used my name. I told him he didn't have to use my name, that everyone knew it was me. That was the entire point. He'd wanted to destroy my reputation, to prove that he was better than me, that his career path was right and mine was wrong, that following rules was more important than saving lives. I pulled out my own documents then, papers I'd brought with me, my surgical records from 40 years at Philadelphia General Hospital, 40 years of patients, 40 years of outcomes. I asked if anyone wanted to know my success rate, wanted to know how many of those unconventional decisions I'd made had actually worked. I handed the papers to Sarah and asked her to read them out loud. She started reading, her voice getting stronger as she went. She read that my 5-year survival rate was 94%, that over my career I'd performed 127 experimental or unconventional procedures, that 119 of those had been successful, a success rate of 93.7%. The room erupted in murmurs. People were genuinely impressed. A 93% success rate on experimental procedures was extraordinary. I said that James Morrison had been one of those 119 successes, that he'd walked out of the hospital alive, that he'd had 10 more months with his family, that the fact he'd died from a drug overdose didn't change the fact that I'd saved his life. Michael's face was bright red now. He insisted this was ridiculous, that I should have been disciplined more severely, that I should have lost my license. I told him I wasn't disciplined more severely because the hospital ethics board had reviewed my case and determined I'd made the right call in an emergency situation, that they'd reprimanded me for not following procedure after the fact, but they hadn't questioned my medical judgment, that they understood something Michael had never understood, that medicine wasn't just about following rules, it was about saving lives. That's when Dr. Patricia Wong stood up. She was 80 years old, long retired, but she'd come to my party because we'd worked together for decades. She'd been my mentor when I'd first started at Philadelphia General. Dr. Wong said she'd been on the ethics board that reviewed my case in 1994, that she'd reviewed all the details personally. She said what I'd done was technically a violation of protocol, but that what I'd done was also brilliant, that I'd saved a man's life using a technique that was ahead of its time, a technique that, by the way, had since been approved and was now standard practice for traumatic heart injuries at hospitals around the world. She looked directly at Michael, told him he'd built his career on playing it safe, on following every rule, on never taking risks, said that was fine, that he was a good surgeon. but that he wasn't a great surgeon. Because great surgeons knew when to break the rules. Great surgeons knew when a life was worth more than a protocol. And Richard Bennett was a great surgeon. The room erupted in applause. Not everyone was clapping. But enough people were. Enough people who understood that medicine was complicated. That ethics were complicated. That sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the thing the rule book said to do. Michael stood there as his face got redder and redder. He'd come to my party planning to destroy me, to humiliate me, to prove he was better. And, instead, he was the one being humiliated, his lies exposed, his jealousy revealed. He said this was absurd and that he was leaving, started gathering his things. Before he could get to the door, I asked him one question, asked him why he'd done this. We'd been friends once. What had I done to make him hate me so much? Michael stopped, turned around, and the truth finally came pouring out of him. He said I'd thrown it all away, that I'd had the talent to be one of the greatest cardiac surgeons in history, that I could have published groundbreaking research, could have taught at Harvard or Johns Hopkins, could have been someone important. But instead, I'd chosen to waste my career at a community hospital treating people who couldn't even afford to pay me. I asked if this was really about my choices, about how I chose to live my life. He said it was about watching me squander my potential, watching me choose mediocrity over excellence, and watching everyone act like I was some kind of saint because I worked at a hospital that served poor people. He said I wasn't a saint, that I was a coward. Too afraid to compete at the highest level. Too afraid to find out if I was actually as good as him. The truth was finally out there. Michael Stevens wasn't angry about protocol violations or medical ethics. He was angry that I'd chosen a different path and been happy with it. That I'd found fulfillment in a way he never had. I told him he was right about one thing. That I wasn't as good as him. That I'd never had his speed, or his precision, or his photographic memory. That if we'd both stayed at the same hospital competing for the same position, he would have beaten me. And I was completely okay with that. I asked if he was okay with being second best. I told him I was okay with being the best version of myself. That I wasn't cut out for Massachusetts General. Wasn't cut out for the politics and the publishing and the constant competition. That I was cut out for helping people who needed help. That I'd spent 40 years doing exactly that. That I'd been happy. And I asked him if he could say the same. His face twisted. He started listing his accomplishments, the awards he'd won, the recognition he'd received internationally, the 200 papers he'd published, the fact that his techniques were taught in medical schools around the world. I told him that wasn't what I'd asked. I'd asked if he'd been happy. He didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because we both knew the truth. Michael Stevens had spent 45 years chasing recognition and respect and proof that he was the best, and none of it had been enough. None of it had made him happy. I told him what had made me happy. Told him about a surgery I'd done 20 years ago on a 16-year-old girl with a congenital heart defect. Her family had no insurance. They'd been turned away by 3 other hospitals. I'd done the surgery for free, spent 12 hours in the operating room repairing her heart. She'd survived, gone on to graduate high school, gone to college, gotten married, had 2 kids of her own, and every year on the anniversary of her surgery, she sent me a card thanking me for giving her a life. I said that's what made me happy. That's what had made 40 years at Philadelphia General worth it. Dr. Wong stood up again, said we'd heard enough, told Michael she suggested he leave, that this was my celebration and he'd disrupted it enough. Michael looked around the room one final time, saw faces that had turned against him, saw people who'd respected him an hour ago, now looking at him with disappointment and disgust. He grabbed his coat and walked out without saying another word. The door closed behind him, and I felt this enormous weight lift off my chest, a weight I'd been carrying for 6 months without even fully realizing it. The fear that people would believe his lies, the worry that my reputation would be destroyed, the doubt about whether I'd made the right choices in my career. But I was still standing. My reputation was intact. The truth had come out. Justice had been served. Jacob Morrison came over to me after Michael left, thanked me for letting him speak, for giving him the chance to tell the truth about his father. I thanked him for coming, for bringing the documentation, for defending me when I needed it most. He said he'd been carrying his father's medical records around for 5 years, hoping he'd find me someday, hoping he could thank me in person for saving his father's life. He said he'd never imagined he'd get to defend me in front of a room full of doctors. I told him his father would be proud of the man he'd become. He said he hoped so, that he'd become a paramedic because of his father, because he wanted to help people the way someone had helped his father when he needed it most, the way I'd helped him. We stood there for a moment, this 30-year-old paramedic and this 70-year-old retired surgeon, connected by a surgery that happened 3 decades ago, connected by a decision I'd made at 2 in the morning to break the rules and try to save a life. The party continued after that. People came up to me, shook my hand, told me they'd never doubted me. Some of them were lying, of course. Some of them had doubted me, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. That's what mattered. Sarah hugged me tight, apologized for inviting Michael without knowing what he was planning. I told her it was okay, that everything had worked out, that the truth had a way of coming out when it needed to. Later that evening, Jennifer and I sat in the hospital parking lot, the same parking lot where I'd parked my car for 40 years, where I'd arrived at 2 a.m. for emergency surgeries, where I'd left after 16-hour shifts, where I'd cried after losing patients I couldn't save. Jennifer asked if I was okay. I told her I was better than okay, that I was free. She asked what I meant. I said I was free from wondering if I'd made the right choices, free from second-guessing my career, free from caring what people like Michael Stevens thought about me, that I'd spent 40 years doing work that mattered, helping people who needed help, training doctors who would go on to help even more people, and Michael had spent 40 years being jealous of that. I'd won. I'd actually won. Jennifer said I'd always known that. I told her I'd known it in my head. But that day, I'd finally felt it in my heart. We drove home to find Sarah's kids waiting. My grandchildren. They wanted to celebrate my birthday properly with cake and presents and silly songs. My oldest grandson asked me what it was like being 70 years old. I told him it was like being 20. Except you knew more. You'd made more mistakes. You'd learned more lessons. You'd helped more people. And you cared a lot less about impressing anyone. He said that sounded nice. I told him it was nice. It was very, very nice. That night I couldn't sleep, went to my study and pulled out my old journals, notebooks I'd kept throughout my career, notes on surgeries, notes on patients, notes on lessons learned. I found the entry from February 1994, the night I'd operated on James Morrison. It said 2:47 a.m., motorcycle accident trauma, 28-year-old male, torn left ventricle, standard repair not viable, decision to attempt mesh reinforcement, experimental but calculated, odds of death 100% without intervention, odds with intervention unknown, patient survived surgery, stable condition, prognosis uncertain. Note to self, sometimes saving a life means breaking a rule. Hope I made the right call. I read that entry several times. That younger version of myself, uncertain, hoping, doing his best in an impossible situation. I picked up a pen and added one more line to that old entry. January 2025. You made the right call. The patient's son came to your birthday party 30 years later to thank you. The technique you pioneered is now standard practice. You saved 119 lives by taking calculated risks. You were a good surgeon. You were a good man. You have no regrets. I closed the journal, put it back on the shelf, went to bed and slept better than I had in months. The next morning I got a call from Dr. Wong. She told me the ethics board at Massachusetts General was reviewing Michael's conduct, that multiple people had filed complaints after my party, that apparently he'd been making similar accusations against other surgeons over the years, using his memoir as an excuse to settle old scores with anyone who'd made him feel inadequate. She said he'd likely face consequences, that his reputation had taken a serious hit, that several conferences had already cancelled his speaking engagements, that some medical journals were reviewing his papers to see if he'd misrepresented other case studies the way he'd misrepresented mine. Dr. Wong also asked if I'd be willing to speak at an ethics symposium next month about the James Morrison case, about the balance between following protocol and saving lives. She said young doctors needed to hear my perspective, needed to understand how to make those impossible decisions. I told her I was retired, but she said I still had wisdom to share, that after what happened at my party, people wanted to hear from me, wanted to understand how I'd maintained such a high success rate on experimental procedures, how I'd known when to break the rules. I agreed on one condition, that Jacob Morrison would come with me, would tell his father's story, so it wouldn't just be theory, so people would understand that these decisions had real consequences, real people, real lives that mattered. The symposium was 3 weeks later. 200 young doctors and medical students, eager faces hungry for knowledge, wanting to understand how to navigate the complicated ethical landscape of modern medicine. I told them about James Morrison, about the decision I'd made at 2 in the morning with a dying patient on my table, about the consequences, about the uncertainty, about the fear that I'd made the wrong call, about the relief when he survived, about the devastation when I learned he'd died a year later. Then Jacob stood up and told his father's story, about the 10 months his father had lived after the surgery, about the letters he'd written home, about his attempts at recovery, about his dreams of being a good father, about how he'd died not from surgical complications, but from the disease of addiction he'd been fighting his whole life. Jacob said, I hadn't killed his father. That addiction had killed his father, but that I'd given him 10 more months, and those 10 months had mattered to his father, to his mother, and to Jacob himself, because they'd shown him that his father was worth saving, that people had believed in him, that someone had taken a risk because they thought his life had value. The students asked thoughtful questions about how I'd known the technique would work, about how I'd lived with the risk, about how I'd coped with the 8 experimental procedures that had failed over my career. I answered as honestly as I could, told them I hadn't known for certain it would work, that I'd made the most informed decision I could with the information I had, that doing nothing would also have been a decision, that trying and failing felt better to me than not trying at all. One young resident asked how she could make those kinds of decisions without being paralyzed by fear. I told her that medicine was uncertainty management, that we never had perfect knowledge or perfect tools, just training and experience and judgment, and we did our best. That's all anyone could do. The symposium went on for hours, real conversations about real ethical dilemmas, the kind of discussions medical schools needed to have more often. Several students came up to me afterward, wanted more advice, wanted to understand how I'd navigated 40 years of impossible decisions. One young woman told me she'd been so scared of making mistakes, scared of being sued, scared of losing her license, scared she wasn't good enough. But listening to me talk about my 8 failures and my 119 successes made her realize that being a doctor meant being willing to fail sometimes, meant being willing to take risks, meant trusting yourself even when you weren't certain. I told her that was exactly right, that being good enough wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, about trying, about learning from failures and celebrating successes, about treating patients as people, not cases. 3 months after my birthday party, I got a letter from Michael. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was an apology, a real one. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, that he didn't deserve it, that what he'd done was petty and cruel and born out of jealousy he'd been carrying for 45 years. He admitted I'd been right, that he'd spent his entire career being the best and winning awards and earning recognition, and none of it had made him happy, because he'd been competing against everyone, including himself. He wrote that he'd resigned from Massachusetts General after the ethics investigation, that his reputation was destroyed, that his memoir deal had been cancelled, that he was 70 years old with nothing to show for his career except awards that didn't mean anything. Meanwhile, I had students who respected me, patients who remembered me, colleagues who defended me. I had a legacy that actually mattered. He said he'd wanted to destroy that because he was jealous, that he'd wanted to prove his path was better than mine, but that he'd been wrong, that I'd won, not because I was the better surgeon, but because I was the better man. The letter ended with an apology. He said he didn't expect a response, just needed me to know. I read that letter 3 times, felt anger at what he'd tried to do, pity for how empty his life had been, sadness that it had taken him 70 years to learn what really mattered. I didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing to say. Michael Stevens had spent 45 years chasing the wrong things. Learning that lesson at 70 was tragic, but it was his journey to take, not mine to fix. I'm 70 years old now. I had a 40-year career at a community hospital that most people have never heard of. I saved thousands of lives. I trained hundreds of residents who went on to save thousands more lives. I made choices that some people questioned. I broke rules when I thought it was necessary to save a life, and I have absolutely no regrets. Michael Stevens tried to destroy my reputation by exposing my so-called ethical violations. Instead, he exposed his own jealousy, his own emptiness, his own failure to understand what medicine is really about. I'm still standing, still teaching occasionally, still sharing the lessons I learned over 40 years. Still showing young doctors that medicine is about more than following rules. It's about helping people. It's about taking calculated risks when lives are at stake. It's about understanding that sometimes saving a life is more important than following a protocol. That's my legacy, not awards or papers or recognition, just the knowledge that I helped people who needed help, that I made a difference in my community, that I chose the right path for me, even when it wasn't the impressive path. And that's enough. More than enough. It's everything. Did you like my story? Which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story with love and respect.